The day Alaric Ashbourne announced his engagement to Lady Seraphine Voss, he made certain Lysandra Evermont heard it from him first. Not out of decency, out of precision. He wanted to watch her face when the knife went in. She gave him nothing, not a tremor in her jaw, not a flinch at the corners of her eyes. Just that stillness that had always unsettled him, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from a woman who has already made a decision you don't yet know about. By nightfall, she had accepted Duke Emeric Blackthorn's proposal. By morning, the Empire was laughing. None of them understood what they were watching. Neither did Alaric. That was his first and most catastrophic mistake. The announcement came at the Voss Midsummer Reception, held in the grand pavilion of Lord Harwick's estate on the eastern edge of the capital. 300 guests, chandeliers burning with enough candles to light a small city. Alaric Ashbourne had always understood the arithmetic of spectacle, that power announced in an intimate room belongs to the room, but power announced in a crowd belongs to history. He had chosen his moment with the same surgical care he applied to everything. The champagne was being poured for the second toast when he rose, pressed Lady Seraphine Voss's gloved hand against his chest, and let the announcement unspool with the ease of a man who had rehearsed it, not because he was nervous, but because he wanted to be certain of the exact emotional effect each syllable would produce. The room erupted. Lysandra Evermont stood 12 feet away, near the eastern colonnade, holding a glass she had barely touched. She had been speaking with Countess Ardelin about the wool tariffs when the words reached her. She did not turn immediately. That was the first thing people noticed, those standing close enough to observe. She did not spin around in shock, did not grip the column beside her, did not do any of the things a woman publicly discarded was supposed to do in the Empire's unofficial theater of aristocratic grief. She turned slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone finishing a thought before acknowledging an interruption. Her eyes found Alaric across the crowd. He was looking directly at her. She had known he would be. There it was. That thing he had always told himself was love, and had slowly revealed itself, in the honest accounting of the past 2 years, to be something far uglier. He wanted her response. He had staged this entire evening around the possibility of her response. She gave him her glass, placed it on the tray of a passing footman without looking at it, and turned back to Countess Ardelin. "You were saying about the eastern provinces?" People talked about that moment for weeks. The women who had expected tears found instead something they couldn't comfortably categorize, and therefore couldn't easily dismiss. The men who had expected a scene found the absence of one more unsettling than any scene could have been. Alaric, for his part, laughed. He pulled Seraphine close and laughed the way men laugh when they're the only ones in on the joke, and the laughter carried across the pavilion and attached itself to Lysandra's back like a label she hadn't agreed to wear. She wore it anyway. She had worn worse. Aught. She had been 19 when she first met Alaric Ashbourne, at his mother's autumn dinner party, back when the Ashbourne name still carried more weight than debt, and before his father's political humiliation had been quietly buried beneath 3 seasons of strategic socializing. Alaric had been 23, brilliant in the way that young men with ambition and no real opposition tend to be, which is to say, impressively capable and almost entirely unaware of his own cruelty, because no one had yet required him to examine it. He had sought her out that first evening. That was what she remembered most clearly, years later, that he had come to her, had wanted her attention specifically, had maneuvered through the drawing room with the focused patience of a man who had already decided what he wanted and was simply completing the steps to acquire it. She had been flattered. She had also been wrong about what exactly he wanted. What Alaric Ashbourne wanted from Lysandra Evermont was not a wife, not a partner, not even a conquest in the common sense. What he wanted was a mirror, a polished, beautiful, well-positioned mirror that reflected back the image of himself he preferred. Capable, admired, chosen by someone worth choosing. She had spent 3 years performing that function before she understood it was a function at all. The understanding had not come all at once. It had arrived in the accumulated weight of small things, the way he spoke over her observations in public and repeated them as his own 5 minutes later. The way her family's reduced circumstances, her father's gambling debts, the Evermont estate mortgaged twice against bad harvests, were never mentioned directly but always present in the subtext of his generosity, so that every dinner invitation and every social introduction carried the invisible footnote of what she owed him for it, the way he categorized her emotions as either useful or inconvenient, with no apparent recognition that the categories themselves were the problem. She had loved him, or something she had mistaken for love. That was the honest accounting she allowed herself in private. The feeling had been real, even if its object had not deserved it. You did not stop a wound from mattering by accurately identifying the cause, but she had also, quietly and without announcing it, stopped waiting for him to change. The morning after the Voss reception, Lysandra received a visitor she had been expecting. Duke Emmerich Blackthorne arrived at the Evermont townhouse, modest by capital standards, situated on a respectable but unremarkable street, at precisely 10 o'clock. He had sent no advance notice. He had, however, sent a brief letter the previous evening, delivered by a footman whose livery she recognized before she had finished reading the first line. She had read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the center of her writing desk, where she could see it from across the room. He was older than she had expected from the portraits, 63, though he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned that speed was rarely the thing that mattered. His hair had gone fully silver, kept close. His face held the particular texture of a man who had survived things that had destroyed people with more apparent advantages, and had decided somewhere in the survival that he was no longer required to pretend those things hadn't happened. He sat across from her in the small sitting room without inspecting the room's modesty or performing the aristocratic courtesy of pretending not to notice it. "I'll dispense with the preliminary," he said. His voice was even, measured in the way of a man who had stopped using it to impress people some time ago. "You already know what I'm here to propose." "I know what your letter suggested," Lysandra said carefully. "It's the same thing. I don't write things I don't mean." She studied him. There was a particular type of dishonesty that wore the costume of directness. Men who deployed plain speaking as a performance of virtue, while the actual terms remained buried in the fine print. She had learned to look for the gap between the manner and the substance. She did not, studying Emmerich Blackthorne in the pale morning light of her sitting room, detect a gap. That unsettled her differently than she had anticipated. "You're aware," she said, "of what people will say." "People will say you married a dying man for his estate," he replied without any particular distress. "They'll be half right. I am dying. Whether the man part and the estate part justify the marriage is a question I'll leave to you to answer." "How long?" He didn't flinch at the directness. "The physicians disagree, as physicians do. The optimistic estimate is 2 years. The realistic estimate is 1. Lysandra held that in silence for a moment. Outside the window, the street noise of the capital continued its ordinary business: cartwheels, voices, the distant metallic rhythm of a smithy. The world had no particular interest in the conversation taking place in this room. "What do you want from this arrangement?" she asked. "Someone to run Blackthorne Manor who isn't after the silverware," he said. "My late wife managed the estate and its political relationships with considerable skill. I've been managing alone for 4 years, and I am, frankly, tired of it. I have matters I need to resolve before I'm done, and I need someone with a functioning mind and enough social standing to be taken seriously in rooms I can no longer always enter." He paused. "I also have information about a number of families in this empire whose continued comfort depends on certain documents remaining unseen." Something shifted in the room's temperature very slightly. "Including the Ashbournes," she said. "Including the Ashbournes," he confirmed. He looked at her with the measuring steadiness of a man who had correctly assessed something and was now offering it the way you offer a tool, without ceremony, but with precision. "I want someone who will use that information wisely, not vindictively, wisely." "Those aren't the same thing," she said. "No," he agreed, and something that might have been satisfaction moved briefly across his features. "They are not. That's why I'm asking you." The silence stretched. A coal shifted in the grate. Lysandra looked past him at the letter on her writing desk, though from this angle she could see only its folded edge. She thought about Alaric's laugh from across the pavilion. She thought about 3 years of carrying someone else's image of her while her own went tended to. She thought, more clearly than she expected to, about the Countess Ardelin finishing her sentence about the wool tariffs, as if the world's loudest announcement had not just been made 12 feet away, and about the fact that she, Lysandra, had let her. "Tell me about these documents," she said. "Posset." They were married 6 weeks later, in a ceremony that the capital's social machinery processed with magnificent efficiency. The version that circulated in drawing rooms and dinner conversations was already fully formed before the ink dried on the registry. Lysandra Evermont, humiliated by Alaric Ashbourne's defection, had accepted the first proposal that arrived regardless of its merits, the merits being, in the common assessment, approximately none. Emmerich Blackthorne was old, widowed, in failing health, and possessed of a reputation for a certain cold, unglamorous integrity that the aristocracy found admirable in principle and tedious in practice. He had no heirs. He had few allies who attended parties. He was, by every social metric that the empire's upper echelons considered meaningful, a terminus, not a destination. Alaric sent a wedding gift, a set of silver candlesticks from his estate's secondary collection, appraised at a value just generous enough to be polite and just modest enough to be a message. He also attended the ceremony, which was unexpected and which Lysandra processed without visible reaction, though she noted, with more precision than she chose to examine in the moment, exactly where he stood, and the exact angle of his expression when Emmerich placed the ring on her hand. He was smiling. Not warmly. The way a man smiles when he has decided an outcome and is gratified to see the evidence confirm it. She returned none of it. She looked at Emmerich's hands, older hands, deliberate and steady, and thought about documents, about information, about the particular architecture of a situation that everyone around her had already concluded they understood completely and dug. The carriage to Blackthorne Manor took 3 hours north of the capital, through country that shifted from the manicured geometry of the Empire's showcase properties to something older and less performed. The estate itself emerged from an avenue of beeches that had been growing there, Emmerich told her without particular sentiment, since his grandfather had planted them as a boy. The manor was substantial but not ostentatious. Stone, serious, maintained with a fidelity to function over impression. The staff assembled in the courtyard, 18 people, from the estate steward to the groundskeeper's apprentice, and Lysandra observed them observing her with the collective assessment of people who had been through a version of this before and had opinions about how it tended to go. Emmerich introduced her simply, without preamble. Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackthorne, she has full authority in the management of the house and grounds. Questions about household matters go to her. No qualifications. No provisional language. Full authority delivered as a statement of present fact, not a promise subject to performance. She felt the staff recalibrate. It was subtle, a shift in posture here, a glance exchanged there. But she had spent enough time learning to read rooms to recognize the moment when a room changes its mind. That evening, Emmerich showed her his study. It was not the kind of study designed to impress visitors. It was the kind of study built by a man who actually used it. Shelves of ledgers and correspondence, maps annotated in at least 3 different inks across years, a writing desk with the worn surface of something that had been a working surface, not a display. And in the locked cabinet beside the south window, which he opened with a key he then placed in her hand, the documents. She sat with them for 2 hours while Emmerich read in the chair by the fire. He offered no explanation, no guidance. He had given her the key. The rest was hers to find. What she found was worse than she had expected. Not in the way of spectacular villainy, said. The documents did not reveal murders, or not directly. They revealed something more durable and more instructive. Forged inheritance records that had redirected 3 generations of a duchy's wealth into a network of creditors whose ultimate beneficiaries traced back, through 6 degrees of deliberate obfuscation, to a holding company that Alaric Ashbourne's late father had established, and that Alaric himself had been quietly sustaining, possibly without full knowledge of its origins, and possibly, the documents here became interestingly ambiguous, with very deliberate knowledge of exactly what it was. She looked up from the last page. Emmerich had not moved. He may not have known, she said carefully. He may not have, Emmerich agreed. But you think he did. I think, Emmerich said slowly, that a man who does not want to know something arranges, with great care and skill, not to know it, and that the arrangement is a choice. He paused. I also think that a man who publicly humiliates a woman he spent 3 years cultivating is not, generally, a man of limited self-awareness. He is a man who understands exactly what he is doing and prefers not to be accountable for understanding it. Lysandra looked back at the documents. The fire made the paper's edges glow briefly amber each time it shifted. These names, she said, some of them are his advisors. His closest advisors. But they would have been operating for years. Decades, in 2 cases. She set the papers down with the particular steadiness of a woman who has just finished calculating something large and wants to give the calculation the respect of a moment before acting on it. "Who else knows about these?" she asked. Emmerich looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that arrived when she asked the question he had been waiting to confirm she would ask. "Until tonight?" he said. "Only me." He reached into the desk's lower drawer and produced a second file, thinner than the first, bound in black ribbon. He placed it on the table between them. "This one," he said quietly, "I found 3 weeks ago. I had been waiting for the right person to show it to." She reached for it. The ribbon came loose cleanly. The first page bore a letterhead she recognized immediately: Imperial Court of Accounts, dated 8 months prior. The second page bore a signature she recognized better than she wanted to. Her hands did not tremble, but the room, for just a moment, tilted at its foundations, because the signature was not Alaric's. It was not any of his advisors. It was a name from the Empire's inner circle, a name attached to offices that did not get publicly named in connection with fraud, a name that meant this was not a story about one corrupt household. This was a story about a system, and Emmerich Blackthorne, with his steady hands and his locked cabinet and his 1 year left to live, had just handed it entirely to her. She raised her eyes from the page. Emmerich was watching her with the grave attention of a man making a transfer, not of property, not of wealth, but of weight. The specific kind of weight you give to someone when you've been carrying it long enough to know you cannot carry it to the end. "The executor of your estate," she said carefully. "When the time comes. Who is it?" Emmerich's eyes did not waver. "As of this morning," he said, "it is Lord Chancellor Drevane." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Lysandra understood, in the sudden crystalline quiet that followed, that she was not sitting in a study in the country with a dying old man who had needed help with the household accounts. She was sitting at the center of something that had been assembling itself for decades, that Emmerich had spent those same decades carefully documenting and just as carefully not deploying, because deploying it required someone with the social standing to survive the backlash, the composure not to use it vindictively, and the specific quality of not having powerful friends who might quietly get there first. He had been waiting, she realized, not for a successor, not for an heir, for her. And Lord Chancellor Drevane, the man who would soon legally control the distribution of everything Emmerich Blackthorne owned, including the locked cabinet, including the documents, including the second file with its imperial letterhead, did not yet know she existed. She closed the file. She set it back on the table. She looked at Emmerich with the full force of a woman who had spent 3 years learning that she had been underestimated and had decided, somewhere in the long accounting of that education, to stop correcting the assumption. "Tell me," she said quietly, "everything you know about Drevane's schedule." Emmerich reached for his tea, unhurried. "I was hoping," he said, "you'd start there." Lord Chancellor Drevane kept a schedule so precise it bordered on a medical condition. Lysandra learned this within 48 hours of beginning her research. Learned it not from documents, which could be falsified or omitted, but from people who were almost always more reliable and almost always underestimated as sources by men who preferred paper. The stable master at Blackthorne Manor had a brother who worked the coaching road into the capital 3 days a week. The brother had a wife who laundered linens for the Chancellor's household staff. The wife knew that Lord Drevane left his townhouse every Tuesday and Thursday at 7:15 in the morning for the Imperial Records Office, and every Friday evening at 6 for the private dinner club on Merchants Row that accepted no new members and kept no written guest lists. Lysandra gathered this the way she gathered everything useful, by asking questions that didn't appear to be the questions she was actually asking, and by listening to the answers with the full weight of her attention, which most people, accustomed to being half-heard, found unexpectedly disarming. She sat with Emmerich that evening in the study and laid out what she had assembled so far. Not the documents. She had spent 3 nights with those, cross-referencing names and dates, until she knew their architecture better than the men who had built it. The schedule, the access points, the gaps. "He'll be appointed executor before you need him to be," she said. It wasn't a question. She had read the paperwork. The appointment was already filed with the Imperial Court, effective upon the Duke's deterioration reaching what the legal language described, with characteristic cold precision, as the point of incapacity. "Approximately 4 months from now, by the physician's current estimate," Emmerich confirmed. He had accepted her directness about the timeline as she had accepted his, as a functional necessity between two people who had agreed not to waste the remaining time on performance. So we have 4 months in which Dravain does not yet control this estate, these documents, or our access to them. 3.5, if you want a margin. She looked at the map spread across the center of the desk. The Empire's administrative districts, annotated in Emmerich's careful hand across the years. Her finger traced the eastern corridor, where 4 of the forged inheritance records originated. The families affected by the Eastern frauds, she said. Are any of them still in a position to act? The Marath family lost the most and have the least to lose by making noise about it. Emmerich set down his pen. Their heir, Corvin Marath, is approximately your age, competent, angry in the specific way of a man who has been told his anger is not appropriate and has spent the intervening years deciding he disagrees. He'd need proof that could be presented without immediately implicating us as the source. He would. Can it be done? Emmerich looked at her steadily. I spent 20 years deciding it couldn't be done safely. You've been here 5 days and you're already locating the mechanism. He paused, and something moved behind his expression that was not quite amusement but occupied the same general territory. I was perhaps too cautious. Or you were waiting for the right conditions, she said. They're different problems. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the beach avenue moved in a late wind, and the sound of it reached them through the stone walls as a low, continuous pressure. Not threatening, just present, the way old places asserted themselves against the business of the living. Write to Corvin Marath, Emmerich said finally. Use the secondary address in the Eastern correspondence file. He'll know what it means. Corvin Marath arrived at Blackthorn Manor 12 days later, unannounced by design. Lysandra had specified in her letter that he should come without prior notice, through the servants' road, which was not surveilled and which delivered him to the kitchen courtyard at dusk, like a man who had decided somewhere in the 200 miles between his reduced estate and this one, that he had nothing left to protect by being careful. He was 31, with the particular leanness of a man who had been comfortable once and had spent several years learning to stop grieving it. His hands were a gentleman's hands that had done more physical work than a gentleman's hands were supposed to. He assessed the kitchen courtyard with quick, unsentimental eyes, and when Lysandra stepped out to meet him, he assessed her the same way, looking for the angle, the cost, the thing she wanted that made this worth the risk of his presence here. She respected that. Wariness in a man who had been comprehensively robbed was not paranoia. It was evidence of functioning intelligence. Your Grace, he said. The title was new enough that people still inflected it slightly differently than they intended, testing whether she wore it or it wore her. Walk with me, she said. The study is being used. It wasn't. But open air meant no one could position themselves against a door. They walked the south perimeter of the garden, where the light was failing and the groundskeeper had finished for the evening. Lysandra spoke first, which she had decided was correct. She was the one who had summoned him, and letting him wait for her to get to the point would read as a negotiating tactic, rather than the straightforwardness she needed him to receive as genuine. She told him what she had, not everything, not the second file, not the Chancellor's name. The Eastern documents, his family's documents specifically. The mechanism of the fraud, laid out with the precision she had spent 12 days refining until it was comprehensible to anyone with a functioning knowledge of imperial inheritance law, which Corvin Marath demonstrably had, because his expression as she spoke shifted through a progression she watched carefully. Recognition, anger, the cold settling that follows anger when anger runs out of immediately useful applications. When she finished, he was quiet for 15 seconds. She counted. You've had these for 12 days, he said. I've had them for 3 weeks. I spent 9 days deciding who to show them to first. And you chose me. I chose the person with the most direct injury and the clearest standing to challenge the record. Legally, your family's claim could be reinstated if the forgeries are properly presented to the Imperial Court of Inheritance. The Imperial Court of Inheritance, he said, is staffed by 3 senior justices, 2 of whom have been on the imperial payroll for longer than these documents have existed. The 3rd hasn't. He stopped walking. Justice Aldine. She was appointed 14 months ago. She has no prior relationship with any of the families in the Eastern Corridor, and a documented record of rulings that follow the letter of Imperial Inheritance Code rather than its creative interpretations. Corvin looked at her with the specific expression of a man recalculating something he had already decided was a closed question. She'd need the originals, he said. Copies can be challenged. I know. Presenting the originals means revealing the source. Not necessarily. There are legal channels for anonymous evidence submission to the Imperial Court. They're obscure and they haven't been used in 40 years, but they exist in the code. The silence that followed was the working kind, not the resistant kind. She could feel him moving through it the way a man moves through a room in the dark, carefully but moving. What do you want from this? He asked, not accusatorially, practically. Dravain, she said. He blinked, just once, but it was real. The Chancellor. He's in the Eastern documents peripherally. His name appears twice in the correspondence, not in the forgeries themselves, but in the communication chain that authorized their filing. If the Marath claim reaches Justice Aldine and the forgeries are examined, the correspondence chain becomes discoverable. That's a long route to a powerful man. It's the only route that doesn't get both of us destroyed before we arrive. Corvin was quiet again. The garden had gone fully dark now, and the manor lights behind them threw long amber shapes across the grass. He was looking past her at nothing, which meant he was looking at the interior math of it. The risks, the timing, the question of whether he trusted a woman he had met 40 minutes ago with the only remaining leverage his family possessed. She didn't push. Pushing here would be the wrong instrument. She had said what was true. He had to arrive at the decision by his own architecture, or the decision would collapse at the first difficulty. I'll need to read the documents myself, he said finally. Of course. And I'll need time to consult with my family's legal representative. Quietly. You have 3 months before the window narrows significantly. Use them carefully. He looked at her directly. You said the window narrows, not closes. I prefer accurate language, she said. The window closes when Dravain takes control of this estate, at which point the originals are no longer in my custody, and the route to Justice Aldine becomes considerably more complicated. He understood the implication. She watched him understand it and watched him not look away from it, which told her what she needed to know about whether he was the right person for the first step of this. All right, he said, show me the documents. Mud. Alaric Ashbourne visited the capital's most exclusive tailor on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of autumn and heard Lysandra's name for the first time since the wedding from the mouth of Lord Fenwick Castle, who mentioned with the particular offhandedness of a man sharing something he considered amusing that the new Duchess of Blackthorn had apparently restructured the estate's grain contracts with 3 Eastern suppliers, negotiated a new rate that improved the manor's yield projections by roughly 18%, and had been seen twice in the company of Countess Ardelen, who was, as everyone knew, not a woman who spent her time with people she did not consider worth the expenditure. Alaric said nothing. He adjusted the line of his jacket in the tailor's mirror and said nothing, which he would not have had to consciously manage if the information had landed the way he expected information about Lysandra to land, with the dull, gratifying weight of confirmed outcome. It did not land that way. He thought about it on the carriage ride back to Ashbourne House. He thought about it while reviewing the afternoon's correspondence. He thought about it, with a persistence that irritated him in direct proportion to his awareness that it was persisting, through the evening dinner with Seraphine and her father, who was discussing the terms of the settlement agreement with the focused enthusiasm of a man who considered financial arrangements the primary language of affection. Lysandra was restructuring grain contracts. Lysandra was meeting with Countess Ardelen. Lysandra, who was supposed to be quietly and conclusively losing, was doing things that sounded filtered through the flatness of Fenwick Cassell's anecdote, like the early movements of a woman building something. He told himself it was the old man's money. It had to be. She had access to Blackthorn resources now, and she was simply deploying them. Any reasonably intelligent person could improve a neglected estate's contracts with sufficient capital behind them. It meant nothing about her specifically. He believed this with the partial, uncomfortable conviction of a man who has constructed an explanation he knows is slightly too small for the thing it's supposed to contain. The letter from his senior estate manager arrived 3 days later. Alaric read it twice in his study, alone, with the door closed. Marcus Holt had managed the Ashbourne financial interests for 11 years. which meant he had been in position during the full duration of Alaric's father's administration and the first 4 years of Alaric's own. He was loyal with the specific loyalty of a man who had made himself indispensable and therefore trusted that his position was secure. He was also, as the letter made increasingly clear in its careful, measured language, beginning to be nervous. The letter concerned an inquiry, not official, not yet. A request for documentation from a junior clerk in the Imperial Records Office, relating to the Ashbourne Estate's property holdings in the Eastern Corridor during the period 16 years prior. The request was technically routine. It was the kind of administrative correspondence that moved through the records office continuously, generating no particular attention. Marcus did not think it was routine. He had written 3 paragraphs explaining why he did not think it was routine, each paragraph more carefully worded than the last, each one advancing the argument without quite arriving at the explicit statement that would commit him to a position from which he could not retreat. Alaric set the letter down. He picked it up again. He read the name of the junior clerk in the records office, an unremarkable name, no one he recognized, and then read the date of the inquiry, and then sat very still for a moment. The date was 4 days after Lysandra Evermont had arrived at Blackthorn Manor as its Duchess. He told himself this was coincidence. He told himself this with the full force of a man who does not believe in coincidence, but would very much prefer, in this particular instance, to make an exception. Then he picked up his pen and wrote a response to Marcus Holt that said, in the careful language of a man who also did not want to commit himself to a position from which he could not retreat, to find out who had initiated the request, and to do it without leaving evidence that the inquiry had been noticed. Lysandra was in the East Wing study when Emmerich found her, 3 weeks into Corvin Marath's review of the documents. The old Duke moved more slowly now than he had in September, not dramatically, but consistently, in the way that made you aware, if you were paying attention, that the line was trending in one direction and would continue to do so. She was aware. She paid attention to everything now with a precision she had not known she possessed before she had a reason to develop it. Survival, she had learned, was largely a function of accurate observation, not intelligence in the abstract, but the specific intelligence of seeing what was actually in front of you rather than what you expected. Marath has agreed, she said before he could speak. She had heard the courier arrive an hour ago and had been waiting. He has. Justice Aldine will receive the submission through the anonymous channel next week. Emmerich lowered himself into the chair by the window with the deliberate care she had stopped pretending not to notice. There's something else. Something in his voice changed the quality of the room's silence. She set down her pen. Holt, Emmerich said. Marcus Holt, Alaric's estate manager. He's been asking questions about the records office inquiry. How do you know? Because the junior clerk who filed the request works for a man who has owed me a professional courtesy for 7 years, and who considers the repayment of professional courtesies a matter of personal honor. He paused. Alaric knows something has moved. He doesn't know what or where it originates, but he's looking. Lysandra absorbed this. The firelight moved across the map on the desk between them. How much time before he locates the source? Holt is competent. A month, perhaps 6 weeks, if we're fortunate. And the Marath submission to Justice Aldine requires how long to process before the correspondence chain becomes discoverable? 60 days under standard procedure, 40 if Aldine prioritizes it. The arithmetic was not comfortable. She ran it again, looking for the margin, and found it narrow and contingent on things she could not fully control, but present. We can make 40 days, she said. Lysandra. Emmerich said her name with the particular weight of a man who has decided to say something he has been carrying for a while. If Holt finds the trail before Aldine completes her review, Alaric will come to you directly. He will not send representatives. He'll come himself, because this will have become, for him, personal in the way that overrides his better judgment. I know. He'll offer you a settlement, something that looks like resolution and functions as burial. He's done it before, with the Carver creditors and with the Duell tenancy dispute. He's very good at it. She looked at the old Duke steadily. I know that too. I want to be certain, Emmerich said, and his voice had that quality now of something being transferred, the weight of it crossing the air between them. That you understand what you're committing to by not taking the settlement. The documents we have touch the Chancellor. The Chancellor has the ear of the imperial household. If this goes wrong, The protection I can offer you has an expiration date that is not far from today. The fire settled. Outside, the first real cold of the season had arrived, and the window glass held it at distance but did not pretend it wasn't there. She thought about Alaric's laugh across the pavilion. She thought about 3 years and every small, practiced erasure she had mistaken for accommodation. She thought about Emmerich's hands placing the key in hers. "I understand what I'm committing to," she said. Emmerich nodded once, slowly, the way men nod when the answer is the one they needed to hear, and the needing of it is also, in its way, a cost. "Then I need to tell you about the third file," he said. She went very still. "I have been waiting," he said quietly, "because I wanted to be certain of you first. I am now certain." He reached into his jacket, not the cabinet, his jacket, which meant he had been carrying it, and placed a slim envelope on the desk between them. "This arrived the day before I wrote to propose our arrangement. It was delivered by hand, no return address, by a courier I have never been able to identify." She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it. "What's in it?" "Evidence," Emmerich said, "that the fraud in the Eastern Corridor was not the origin. It was the rehearsal." He met her eyes. "The origin is 23 years old, and it involves a name that, if it becomes public, will not merely destroy Alaric Ashbourne's political career." He paused. "It will end the current imperial administration entirely." The envelope sat between them on the desk, unremarkable in its appearance, carrying the weight of an empire's worth of buried decisions. Lysandra's hand moved toward it, steadied, and stopped. Because from the corridor outside she heard the sound she had not been expecting at this hour, on this evening. The sound of carriage wheels on the Blackthorn approach road, moving fast, and the stable boy's voice, high and startled, calling out a name. The name was Ashbourne. The carriage wheels hit the gravel hard, the way carriages move when the driver has been told speed matters more than arrival in good condition. Lysandra heard the horses pulled up short, heard the stable boy's voice crack on the second syllable of the name, and felt the envelope still beneath her fingertips on the desk. She did not reach for it. Not yet. "How many in the carriage?" she asked. Emmerich had already moved to the window, with more speed than she had seen from him in 2 weeks. He looked out at the approach road, and what she read in the set of his shoulders was not fear. It was the particular stillness of a man assessing a situation he had hoped to have more time to prepare for. 2 outriders. The carriage itself. 4, perhaps 5 men total. She picked up the envelope, crossed to the cabinet, placed it inside with the other files, and locked it. She put the key in the inside pocket of her dress, against her ribs, where it would require deliberate search to find. "He can't search the house without cause," she said. "He has no legal standing here." "He doesn't need legal standing tonight." Emmerich turned from the window. "He needs you off balance. That's what this visit is designed to produce." He looked at her steadily. "Don't be off balance." She smoothed the front of her dress, breathed once, evenly, took the measure of herself. The cold in her hands, the elevated pace of her pulse, the way the room had narrowed slightly in the way rooms narrow when danger enters the perimeter, and then set all of it to one side, not suppressed but acknowledged, filed as data rather than experience. "Send word to Corvin Marath tonight," she said. "Don't wait for morning." "Already decided," Emmerich said. She walked out to meet Alaric Ashbourne. He was standing in the entrance hall when she reached it, still in his traveling coat, hat in hand, with the studied informality of a man who had arrived unannounced and wanted his presence to read as casual rather than calculated. He was alone. His men remained outside, which meant he understood that entering with an escort would have constituted a declaration too explicit for the current stage of whatever he had decided this was. He looked at her the way he always looked at her when she had done something he hadn't anticipated, with an expression that moved too quickly between several things to fully commit to any of them. Assessment. Something older and less comfortable that he would not have named as uncertainty, but that functioned identically. "Lysandra," he said. "Your Grace," she said. The title landed between them with precision. His jaw tightened, barely, the way it tightened when he encountered a social instrument he hadn't introduced and could not immediately control. "I was in the area," he said. "I thought I'd—" "You were 2 hours north of anywhere you have business being," she said pleasantly. "What do you want, Alaric?" He let the pretense go. She had expected him to maintain it longer. He was generally more patient with his own performances, but something about the evening, about whatever Marcus Holt had told him, had eroded his usual architecture. He looked around the entrance hall with the slow deliberateness of a man cataloging what he sees, pricing it, locating it in a mental map of threat and resource. "Walk with me," he said. "I don't think so." He looked back at her. "I'm not here to fight with you." "Then say what you came to say from where you're standing." A beat. He turned his hat over in his hands once, a gesture she recognized, the specific physical tell of a man organizing his approach, and then set it on the entrance table with the deliberateness of someone choosing to stop managing his appearance. "There are inquiries moving through the records office," he said, "concerning the Eastern Corridor properties, concerning documentation from 16 years ago." He watched her face. "You know about them." "I know about a great many things," she said. "Emmerich's household has extensive correspondence. The inquiries originated from this estate." "That's a serious allegation for a social call." "Lysandra." His voice dropped, lost its performance quality, became the voice he used when he had decided to be direct, in the specific way that was still, at its foundation, a form of pressure. "I'm not interested in a legal confrontation. I'm here because there are documents that, if they reach certain offices, could cause damage extending well beyond my household, damage to families who have done nothing to you, damage to people who are not part of whatever you think this is." She studied him. The firelight from the hall sconces moved across his face and showed her something she had not expected to find there. Not the confidence she associated with him, but something that sat behind the confidence like a structure revealed when the facade develops a crack. He was genuinely frightened, not of her, or not only of her, of whatever he knew about what those documents contained. "What would you offer?" she said. He blinked. He had expected more resistance before this question, which told her she had asked it at the right moment. "The Evermont debt," he said. "Cleared. Completely. Your father's estate, restored. I have the connections to manage the creditors quietly, and a formal letter of introduction to 3 families in the Northern Court who are currently consolidating influence. Your position here secured, regardless of—" He paused, looked at the hallway around him. "Regardless of what happens to the current Duke." She let the silence extend to its natural length. "You know what's in the documents," she said. "I know enough." "Do you know about the Chancellor?" The change in his face was very small and absolutely conclusive. He knew about the Chancellor. "Go home, Alaric," she said. "Lysandra, go home. Whatever brought you here tonight, it has not produced the result you needed, and staying longer will not improve that." She held his gaze. "I'll have your carriage brought around." He stood there for a moment, and what moved across his face in that moment was not anger. Anger would have been manageable, familiar, the emotion she had spent 3 years learning to navigate. What moved across his face was something rawer and less articulate, the expression of a man who has organized his entire understanding of a situation around one central assumption and who is watching that assumption develop a fracture line he cannot locate the origin of. He picked up his hat. He left. She listened to the carriage wheels on the gravel until they faded, and then she stood in the entrance hall alone for 60 seconds, breathing carefully, before she walked back to the study. The betrayal did not arrive the way betrayals announced in her mind always had, with drama, with confrontation, with the decency of being visible before it landed. It arrived 4 days later in the form of a letter from Justice Aldine's office, addressed to Emmerich, delivered by Imperial Courier at 9 in the morning, with the red seal of the Court of Inheritance on the outer fold. She opened it because Emmerich was with his physicians. She read it 3 times. The anonymous submission through the inheritance channel had been received. It had been reviewed by Justice Aldine personally. It had been found legally sufficient for preliminary investigation. It had also been reviewed, as procedural requirement dictated, by the senior administrator of the Court of Inheritance, who was responsible for assigning investigative resources to new submissions. The senior administrator was a man named Harwick Tollins. Lysandra had seen that name once before, in the Eastern correspondence files, in a letter dated 19 years ago, written in a hand she had not identified because it was not signed with the writer's full name, only initials. H.T. She sat with the letter in the study, and the full architecture of what she was looking at assembled itself in the silence with the merciless clarity of a thing that has been true for some time finally becoming visible. Tollins had the submission. Tollins had the originals. They had been required for the anonymous channel, just as she had told Corvin they would be needed. Tollins was in the correspondence chain. Tollins worked every day within 3 offices of Lord Chancellor Dravain. She had handed the evidence to the infrastructure of the very system the evidence was designed to expose. The cold that moved through her was not shock. Shock implied she had not considered this possibility. She had considered it, dismissed it as requiring an adversary with both the foresight to position an ally in the court's administrative offices years in advance, and the current knowledge of her specific plan. She had calculated that Alaric couldn't have known the channel she was using. She had been correct that Alaric couldn't have known. She had been wrong about who else might have. The question wasn't Alaric. The question was who had sent Emmerich the 3rd file. She was in the east corridor when she heard it. Voices from the study, carrying through the stone in the particular way sound moved through Blackthorn Manor when the interior doors were open. Emmerich's voice, and another she did not recognize. She stopped walking. The stranger's voice was low, male, measured with professional evenness. She caught fragments. The word submission, the word originals, the word recovered. She did not move toward the study door. She moved back silently to the servants' staircase and came around through the kitchen passage to the study's secondary entrance, the one behind the bookcase, which she had discovered in her 2nd week and which she had not mentioned to anyone because there was no pressing reason to mention it, and because she had the instinct, confirmed by everything Emmerich had taught her, that unmentioned resources had a different value than deployed ones. She positioned herself where she could see through the 2-inch gap the secondary door left when it sat in its frame. The man standing across from Emmerich was approximately 50, well-dressed without ostentation, with the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms where decisions were made. She did not recognize him. She memorized his face with the focused efficiency she had developed for exactly this kind of encounter. "The submission has been secured," the man said. "Tollins will hold it pending review. No action will be taken." Emmerich was seated. His hands were flat on the desk, very still. "And Merath? Has been advised that proceeding would constitute interference with an active Imperial investigation. He's been given to understand the personal consequences of non-compliance." A silence. "The 3rd file," Emmerich said. "You want it returned." The Chancellor is prepared to be reasonable about the estate disposition. Her Grace's position would be respected. The properties, the title, everything continues as planned. The document originals are returned, the submission is quietly closed, and everyone moves forward with an equitable arrangement. "Equitable," Emmerich said. "The Chancellor is a reasonable man when given the opportunity to be." Emmerich looked down at his hands. He looked down at them for long enough that the stranger shifted his weight, fractionally. The way men shift when the silence they're inside begins to feel less like consideration and more like a different kind of answer. "I'll need time to consider," Emmerich said. "Of course." The stranger's voice had recovered its evenness. "The Chancellor would appreciate a response by end of week." The interview ended. She heard the man leave. She heard Emmerich remain at his desk, not moving, and in the quality of his stillness, she understood that he had known this was coming. Not this specifically, not today, but the general shape of it, the system closing around them, the channel they had chosen turning out to be already occupied. She stood behind the bookcase and understood something about the old Duke that she had not fully understood before. He had spent 20 years knowing what he knew and not deploying it, and she had read that as excessive caution, as the caution of a man who had lacked the right partner. But there was another reading, and it was sitting in her chest like a stone right now, that he had spent 20 years deploying it and losing, in variations too numerous to list, to a system that had more positions than he had moves. The 3rd file, the anonymous delivery. Someone had sent it to Emmerich because someone had wanted Emmerich to show it to whoever he was going to choose as his inheritor, and whoever he chose was going to pick it up and use it, and using it was going to walk them directly into the mouth of something that had been waiting. She had been maneuvered, not by Alaric, not by Dravain, by someone who understood that the right move against a woman building an evidence case was not to destroy the evidence. It was to let her build it and then take it. She stepped back from the door. The key was still against her ribs. The cabinet was still locked. The 3rd file was still inside it. She had 60 seconds before she needed to decide what kind of person she was going to have to become to survive what came next. She thought about the man's face. She thought about Tollins. She thought about Corvin Marath, somewhere in the eastern corridor, being threatened in language designed to be unchallengeable. She thought about Emmerich at his desk, hands flat, already knowing. One thing she had learned in the education of the last 2 months was that the difference between a position and a trap was almost always a function of what you were willing to use. She had entered this with a clear moral architecture. She would use the documents, but not vindictively, not as weaponry, as correction. Emmerich's words, use it wisely. Wise had assumed she was operating in a system where wisdom had operational value. She was not operating in that system. The stone in her chest settled, not lighter, but more defined, the way weight becomes workable when you stop pretending it isn't there. She was going to walk into that study and look at Emmerich, and she was going to be different than the woman who had walked out of it 20 minutes ago. Not harder, exactly. That wasn't the right word. More accurate. More willing to look at the full geometry of what she was standing inside, rather than the version of it that preserved her preferred understanding of her own choices. She pushed the bookcase door open and walked in. Emmerich did not startle. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for the specific weight of her footstep. "How long?" she said. "Have you known about Tollins?" A pause. "Long enough to be honest." "I suspected," he said, "for approximately 3 weeks. And the anonymous delivery, the third file. I don't know who sent it." He held her gaze. "That is true. I have a theory I am not certain enough of to state as fact." "State it as a theory, then." Emmerich looked at her, and in the firelight his face held the full weight of a man who had run out of time to continue being careful with her. "I believe the third file was sent by someone inside the Chancellor's own organization," he said. "Someone who wants Dravain exposed but cannot move directly. Someone who needed an external actor to carry the evidence into a position where it could either destroy him or be destroyed, along with the actor, in a way that serves as a lesson to anyone else who might try." She stood with that. "We were the test case," she said. "Or the sacrifice," he said quietly. "I could not tell which, when it arrived, and I convinced myself that the right partner would make the difference." He paused. "I may have been wrong. I am sorry." She crossed to the cabinet, unlocked it, took out the third file and held it in her hands, looking at the envelope, feeling its weight as something other than what she had thought it was when she first reached for it. "Dravaini's man said the estate disposition would be respected," she said. "He did. He didn't say the same about Marath." "No," Emmerich said. "He did not." She put the third file into her dress pocket, next to the key. It fit exactly. "Then we don't trade the file," she said. "We use it differently." She looked at Emmerich. "I need you to tell me the one name in this empire that Dravain cannot afford to have see this document. Not a justice, not a court administrator, someone outside the system entirely." Emmerich was quiet for a moment. "There is one," he said slowly, "but reaching her requires a contact I severed 12 years ago for reasons that made sense at the time and will complicate the approach." "Complicate how?" "She will not speak to me. She may speak to you." He paused. "She is the widow of the man who originally discovered the fraud 23 years ago. Her husband was killed before he could present his findings. She has been waiting since then for someone to arrive with enough evidence to make his death mean something." The fire settled. Outside, wind moved through the beach avenue. "Her name?" Lysandra said. "Maren Aldrich," Emmerich said. "She lives under a different name, in the eastern provinces, under Dravain's indirect protection, which is to say, she is watched and controlled and believes herself to be without allies." "She's wrong about that now." "Yes," Emmerich said, with the gravity of a man making a final commitment. "She is." From outside at the edge of the property, the sound of horses. Not carriage horses this time. Not the controlled rhythm of a formal visit. 3 animals moving fast, splitting at the gate, taking positions. She went to the window. The men outside wore no livery she recognized. They were not Ashbourne men. They were not Imperial couriers. They were positioned at the 3 points of the property's access roads with the professional spacing of people who had done this before. They were not there to deliver a message. They were there to make certain no message left. Her hand closed around the third file against her ribs. The key was cold against her skin. Corvin Marath was unreachable. The submission was captured. The evidence channel was closed. Emmerich's man outside the Capitol was compromised. Every path she had spent 2 months building was gone, except one. Maren Aldrich in the eastern provinces, who had been waiting 23 years, who was watched and isolated and believed herself without allies, and who was about to receive a visitor no one currently watching this property had any reason to anticipate, because no one watching this property knew about the servants' road. "Is there a horse in the eastern stable," she said, "that can run 4 hours without stopping?" Emmerich looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who had been hoping she would arrive at exactly this question. "Yes," he said. "Her name is Calla. She knows the eastern road." Lysandra turned from the window. Everything she had been before tonight, careful, measured, working within the system's available channels, was no longer sufficient for what came next. She understood this the way you understand physical facts, without sentiment, without the luxury of grieving the version of the situation you'd preferred. The woman who had walked into Blackthorn Manor 2 months ago with a plan and a set of documents and a belief that the right combination of legal instruments and patient strategy would be enough had just run into the hard edge of how power actually protected itself. That woman was finished. What walked out of the study and toward the eastern stable, in the dark, with a third file pressed to her ribs, and 3 armed men on the access roads who were watching the wrong exits, was something that had not existed before tonight, something that had been made, specifically, by the last 20 minutes of her life. She didn't have a name for it yet. She didn't need one. Not tonight. Tonight she just needed to ride. The eastern road out of Blackthorn was not a road so much as a memory of one. 2 ruts pressed into the earth by generations of supply carts, running through the back of the estate's woodlot and emerging half a mile beyond the property line onto the open country that stretched toward the Empire's agricultural corridor. No lampposts, no maintained surface, just cold ground and the dark pressing in from both sides, and Calla's breathing in front of her, steady and deep, the horse moving with the focused intelligence of an animal that knew this route better than its rider did. Lysandra rode low and kept her weight forward. The file was inside her coat, flat against her sternum, and she could feel it with every stride. Not the paper exactly, but the knowledge of what the paper contained, pressing back against her ribcage like a second heartbeat that had arrived uninvited and refused to leave. She did not think about the men at the access roads. They were behind her now, watching gates she had not used. She thought about Emmerich in the study, sitting with the knowledge that she had left, and the knowledge of what her leaving meant. She thought about the conversation she had not been able to finish, the third file, still unread in its entirety, the name she had seen on its second page that had tilted the room's foundations. She thought about Maren Aldrich in the eastern provinces, waiting 23 years in the particular way that people wait when they have stopped expecting anyone to come and have made a life inside the waiting instead. What did you say to a woman like that? What did you offer her that wasn't another version of the thing she had already been offered and watched fail? The truth, she decided. The truth and the file. And the one thing Maren Aldrich had never had before. Someone who had already made the same decision her husband had made and was still moving. Calla ran, and the darkness held, and Lysandra let both of them work. Quote, she reached the village of Aldenmere at 3 a.m, cold through to the architecture of her bones, with her hands stiff on the reins and the kind of exhaustion in her shoulders that was not tiredness, but the physical residue of sustained fear metabolized into motion. She found the inn Emmerich had described, left Calla with the stable hand, and went to the back room where a man named Torsten, Emmerich's severed contact, the reason for the complication, was sitting with a cup of something hot, and the specific alertness of a person who had been told to expect a visitor and had not been told when. He was 60s, heavy-set, with a face that had been broken at least once, and had reassembled itself with pragmatic indifference to the original arrangement. He looked at her the way people looked at her after the ride, assessing the state of her, calibrating what kind of conversation was available to a person in that condition. Emmerich sent you, he said. Emmerich told me where to find you, she said. I sent myself. A pause. He set down the cup. You've got the file. I've got everything. She sat down across from him without being invited and pulled off her gloves. Her fingers were white. She pressed them flat on the table to warm them. I need Maren Aldrich's location, and I need it tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. before whoever Dravain has in the eastern corridor finishes running down the reason I left Blackthorn on the servants' road. Torsten looked at her for a long time. She let him look. She did not perform urgency for him because urgency performed was urgency questioned, and she did not have time for questions. "She's 3 miles east," he said finally. "The farmhouse with the blue gate. She'll answer if you use the name Calloway." He paused. "She won't be happy to see someone from Emmerich's direction." "She doesn't have to be happy," Lysandra said, standing. "She has to open the door." Marin Aldrich opened the door on the third knock, with a lamp in one hand and the particular expression of a woman who has answered late-night knocking before and has calibrated her responses accordingly. She was late 50s, slight, with white hair worn practically short, and eyes that had the quality of still water, surface smooth, depth unreadable, and the understanding behind them that calm was a choice made under pressure rather than an absence of pressure. She looked at Lysandra. She looked at the state of her, the riding coat, the hours of cold road on her face, the specific quality of controlled urgency that no amount of composure entirely concealed. "Calloway sent me," Lysandra said. Marin stepped back from the door. The farmhouse interior was simple, kept with the order of someone who had reduced their life to its functional elements and found a kind of authority in the reduction. A fire, low but maintained. Books. A writing desk with recent correspondence that Marin did not move to conceal, which told Lysandra she was either not afraid or had decided fear was no longer a useful organizational principle. "You have something," Marin said. It was not a question. She sat across the fire and looked at Lysandra with the patience of a woman who had outlasted several previous versions of this conversation and was reserving judgment on whether this one would be different. Lysandra took out the third file. She placed it on the table between them. Marin did not reach for it immediately. She looked at the envelope and something moved across her face. Not shock, nothing that dramatic. The precise adjustment of a person who has been holding a very specific kind of weight for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down and does not yet trust the instruction. "Dravani's name is on the second page," Lysandra said. "The connection to your husband's findings is on the fourth. The imperial household signature is on the sixth." She paused. "There is a woman inside the Empire's central administration. I believe she is the one who sent this file to Emmerich, to initiate a chain of events that would surface the evidence through an external actor rather than through channels Dravain already controls. I think she chose Emmerich because she knew he had the documentation. I think she is running out of time to wait for a better opportunity." "Who is she?" Marin said. "I don't know her name yet, but she has access at the level indicated by the Imperial signature on page 6, which means she is either very close to the administrative center or she is the administrative center." Marin reached for the file. She read it in the firelight slowly, with the focused attention of a person reading something they have been imagining for 2 decades, not looking for surprises, but confirming one by one the things they had already assembled in their mind against the day the proof arrived. Lysandra watched her read and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say that the file didn't say more directly. When Marin reached the 6th page, she stopped. She did not look up immediately. She sat with her finger on the signature, not pressing it, just resting there, and her breathing was the only sound in the room besides the fire. "He was killed 3 weeks after he found this," she said. "It was ruled an accident." "I know." "Dravain was at the inquiry. I know." Marin set the file down. She looked at Lysandra with the full force of a woman who has crossed the distance between grief and action so many times she no longer feels the terrain beneath her feet. She just moves. "What do you need from me?" she said. "A name," Lysandra said. "One person, outside Dravain's network, with the standing to present this file to the Imperial household in a way that cannot be intercepted or rerouted. Someone Dravain cannot touch before the presentation is complete." Marin was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "General Harwick Stern," she said. "He commands the 3rd Imperial Division. He and Dravain have been enemies since the Border Commission 12 years ago. He is incorruptible in the specific way of men who have enough money and enough legacy that corruption offers them nothing they don't already have." She paused. "He also knew my husband. They served together in the Eastern campaigns." Lysandra felt the geometry of it click into place. Not with relief, not yet, but with the cold, functional satisfaction of a problem revealing its solution. "Can you reach him?" "By morning," Marin said. "If you're willing to ride again." And she was willing. They rode together, Marin on a horse that knew these roads the way Calla had known the Blackthorn servant's path, by memory and muscle rather than visible surface. The pre-dawn eastern countryside was flat and gray and utterly indifferent to the two women crossing it at speed, and Lysandra rode in the particular internal silence that arrives when you have made every decision available to you and are now simply in the execution, where thinking is no longer the primary instrument. She thought about Emmerich anyway. She thought about the locked cabinet and what it meant that he had been carrying this for 20 years, and had found, at the end, not a legal solution or a political solution, but a person, and had decided that was the same thing, or close enough. She thought about his hands flat on the desk, very still, in the moment before the stranger left the study. She thought about the weight he had transferred across the desk the night he showed her the files, and she understood now that it was not strategic weight or evidentiary weight. It was the weight of a man who had watched the right thing fail enough times to know that doing the right thing and surviving it required a specific combination of circumstances he had not been able to assemble alone. He had assembled her. She hoped he was still in the study when she got back. She held that hope like you hold something irreplaceable while moving fast, carefully, with the awareness that holding carefully and moving fast were in constant tension, and that you did not resolve that tension, you managed it, every step. Tiki. General Harwick Stern received them at his field headquarters in the garrison town of Korath at 7:15 in the morning, which meant he had been awake for some time and had been told they were coming. He was 68, built along the lines of a man who had spent his life in physical environments that did not negotiate, with a face that showed every one of those years without apology. He looked at Marin first. Something moved across his face. 22 years, he said. 23, Marin said. He nodded once, with the gravity of a man for whom numbers like that carry specific moral weight. Then he looked at Lysandra. "You're Blackthorn's widow," he said. She held his gaze. "Not yet. Word out of the capital says Emmerich is—" He stopped. His eyes read her expression. "I see. Read the file," she said, and handed it to him. He read it standing, in the middle of his campaign tent, with the sounds of the garrison morning carrying in from outside. He read it the way military men read intelligence, fast, comprehensive, without the hesitation of a civilian encountering difficult information. He turned pages without pausing, and when he reached the 6th page, he did pause, but only for a moment. "This signature," he said. "Yes. If this is authentic—" "I have the original documentation chain from Emmerich Blackthorn's private files covering 18 years of corroborating evidence," she said. "I have the forged inheritance records from the Eastern Corridor. I have correspondence linking Dravain to the authorization of those forgeries. And I have a witness," she looked at Marin, "whose husband died in possession of the first version of this evidence 23 years ago." Stern looked at the file. He looked at Marin. He looked at Lysandra with the comprehensive assessment of a man determining not whether a situation was real, but whether the person standing in it could hold their position under the weight of what came next. "If I present this to the imperial household," he said carefully, "Dravain will have 12 hours, at most, before it reaches the review committee. In those 12 hours, he will move to neutralize every asset connected to this evidence. That means Blackthorn Manor. That means the secondary documentation. That means—" He looked at her. "Everyone who carried this file." "I know. Do you have protection at the manor?" "Emmerich has a private garrison, 12 men, loyal." She paused. "Dravain's men are already positioned on the access roads. 12 against how many?" "I don't know yet." Stern looked at her with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he does not particularly enjoy. "I can have a company of the 3rd Division at Blackthorn Manor in 6 hours. That addresses the garrison problem." He set the file down on his campaign table, very deliberately, in the way of a man placing a bet he has decided to make and wants the physical act to mark the commitment. "But I need something from you first. Name it." "The woman who sent this file to Emmerich," he said. "You said you don't know her name. I think you're wrong. I think you know part of it, and you haven't finished the reasoning yet." She looked at him. The tent was quiet. Behind her, Marin's breathing was steady. The signature on the 6th page. the imperial letterhead. The timing. Delivered the day before Emmerich had written his proposal to Lysandra, which meant whoever had sent it had known Emmerich was looking for someone before Emmerich had finished deciding who that someone was, which meant they had access not just to imperial administration, but to Emmerich's private correspondence, which meant they were inside his household, or inside the office of someone with access to it. Or they were inside Dravain's office, watching Dravain watch Emmerich, and had sent the file as a preemptive move the moment they understood Dravain was about to act. Dravain's office. Someone with the standing to access an imperial signature embedded in the Chancellor's own administration, running a 23-year counter-operation from inside the enemy's structure. She thought about the man who had visited Emmerich. His professional evenness, his language. The Chancellor is prepared to be reasonable. Not the Chancellor has ordered, prepared to be reasonable. The language of an intermediary putting distance between himself and the instruction. The man who came to Emmerich's study, she said slowly. He delivered Dravain's offer. He was Dravain's representative. She paused. He was also extremely careful not to explicitly threaten me. Every pressure in that conversation was implication, not statement. A man acting purely on Dravain's behalf has no reason to be careful about that distinction. Stern waited. He was managing two sets of instructions simultaneously, she said. Dravain's and his own. Stern picked up the file again. He turned to the 6th page. He looked at the signature. The man who came to Emmerich's study, he said. Describe him. She described him. Stern's expression did not change, but something behind it did. The specific interior adjustment of a man confirming a thing he had suspected and finding the confirmation both useful and costly. His name is Aaron Voss, Stern said. He is Dravain's senior aide. He paused. He is also the man who, 14 years ago, came to me privately and told me that if I ever found proof of what Dravain had been doing in the Eastern Corridor, he would help me move it. The tent held that information in silence for a moment. He's been inside Dravain's operation for 14 years, Lysandra said. At minimum. Waiting for the right evidence package. Waiting for someone who could carry it fast enough that Dravain couldn't close the door before it reached me. Stern looked at her. You rode 4 hours in the dark and arrived at my garrison at 7 in the morning. I'd say the timing is adequate. From outside the tent, the sound of the garrison shifting, boots on hard ground, the clipped efficiency of a company being assembled. Stern had given the order before she had finished describing the man from the study. She had not seen him do it. He had done it in the negative space of her description, through whatever signal passed between a general and his command staff in the language of a glance. 6 hours to Blackthorn. The file in Stern's hands. Aaron Voss somewhere in the capital, running both sides of a board that was about to be overturned entirely. Dravain with 12 hours of warning once Stern moved. And Emmerich, in the study, with 12 men in the locked cabinet and whatever time was left. Her horse was outside. She had ridden 4 hours on no sleep, and the cold was still in her hands, and her ribs ached from the pressure of the file against them all night. None of that was information that changed what she did next. She looked at Stern. I'm going back. I know, he said. He held the file. I'll protect this with my division and my life, Duchess. You have my word. I know, she said. She turned for the tent entrance. Lysandra. Marin's voice behind her. She turned. The older woman stood with the file's absence already incorporated into her expression, the look of someone who has handed over the most important thing they have carried for 23 years and is still standing, which requires a recalibration of what standing means. She looked at Lysandra with something that was not gratitude exactly. It was more specific than gratitude. My husband believed, Marin said, that the system could be made to work if you put the right evidence in front of it. He died for that belief. She paused. I don't think that's why you're doing this. Lysandra held her gaze. No, she said. It isn't. Good, Marin said. That's why it might actually work this time. She pushed Calla hard on the return road and reached the Blackthorn perimeter in just under 5 hours. The men at the access roads had not moved. They were still posted, which meant Dravain's network had not yet received news of Stern's involvement, or had received it and had not yet processed its implications. Either gave her a window. She came in on the servants' road again, from the opposite direction this time, and reached the kitchen courtyard at noon to find it organized with the controlled tension of a household that has understood, in her absence, that the situation has become structural. The estate steward met her in the courtyard. His name was Brennan, 51, a man with the compact efficiency of someone who had been running this household through difficult years and had opinions about how difficult could get. "The men on the access roads doubled at dawn," he said. "8 now. They're not moving, but they're watching the main approaches." "Stern's company arrives in approximately 1 hour," she said. "They'll come on the northern road. When they do not engage the men on the access roads. Let Stern's officers manage the positioning." Brennan looked at her with the assessment of a man recalibrating the situation he thought he understood. "You reach Stern." "I reach Stern." Something in his shoulders released, fractionally, the way a held position releases when the relieving force appears on the horizon. "His Grace," he said, "he's been asking for you since 7. She was already moving. Agate said. Emmerich was not at his desk when she reached the study. He was in the chair by the window, and the change in him from the night before was visible in the way that changes become visible when you have been paying very close attention. Not dramatic, not sudden, but present in the altered economy of his movements, the way he held his own weight. He looked up when she came in. She told him everything, quickly, in the compressed sequential language of someone reporting to a commander. Torsten, Marin, the ride, Stern, Aaron Voss, the company on the northern road, the file in Stern's possession. She told it without performance, and he received it the same way, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Voss, he said. I should have considered Voss. You were managing too many variables. That's a charitable interpretation. It's an accurate one. She sat down across from him. The window behind him showed the estate grounds, ordinary, December pale, the beach avenue bare, and the sky low and white. The men on the access roads were visible from this angle as two shapes near the eastern gate, not moving. Stern's company changes the external position. The file is protected. Dravane has 12 hours before the review committee sees it. Then we have 12 hours to ensure that the secondary documentation is secured in Stern's custody rather than this cabinet, Emmerich said. I'll ride to Korath again when his company arrives. No. His voice was quiet but absolute. You've ridden enough. We send Brennan with the documents under military escort. He paused. There's something else. She waited. Alaric was here, he said. This morning. Early. Something cold moved through her that was separate from the tactical situation entirely. He came to the house directly, Emmerich said. Brennan turned him at the door. But he left a letter. He gestured to the desk. She crossed to it. The letter was unsealed. Brennan had read it, which was correct, and she would have told him to do exactly that. She read it standing. Alaric's handwriting, which she knew as well as her own from 3 years of correspondence. Controlled, precise. The handwriting of a man who understood that the manner of writing communicated something beyond the content. The content was brief. He had learned of Stern's involvement. He did not know how. The speed of it suggested a network she had not fully mapped, someone in Korath, or on the northern road with a line into Ashbourne House. He was not writing to threaten. He was writing, in language stripped of its usual social architecture, to say one thing, that the documents concerning the Ashbourne Eastern holdings were separate from the Chancellor's fraud, that he had not known the full scope of his father's arrangements when he inherited them, that he was prepared to provide evidence of that separation to any investigating body. He was not asking for mercy. He was not asking for anything. The letter contained no ask. It was a statement, delivered in the language of a man who had spent a long night in the company of information that had destroyed his previous understanding of his own history. She read it twice. She set it down. Emmerich watched her. He said nothing. Outside, from the northern road, the sound arrived. Ordered, rhythmic, the specific percussion of a military company moving at pace. Stern's men, ahead of schedule. And from the capital direction, simultaneously, the sound she had been expecting since the access roads doubled at dawn. A second carriage, moving fast, with the outrider configuration of an official imperial vehicle. Not Alaric. The crest on the carriage door was visible from the study window as it came up the main approach, a crest she recognized from the third file's letterhead, from the imperial signature on page 6. Dravane had not waited for Stern to move. He had moved first. She looked at Emmerich. He looked at her. He's here, she said. Yes. Emmerich's voice was steady. He will try to take the cabinet before Stern's company reaches the gate. They're 2 minutes out. He needs one. From the entrance hall below, Brennan's voice, clipped, controlled, managing the gap between a household receiving an uninvited guest and a garrison holding a position. The sound of boots on stone. Multiple men. Her hand found the key against her ribs. The cabinet behind her held 18 years of Emmerich's documentation, the full secondary record, the corroborating evidence, the thing that made the third file in Stern's possession something more than an isolated accusation. Without it, the file was serious. With it, the file was conclusive. Gervain understood that arithmetic as well as she did. She looked at the cabinet. She looked at the window. Stern's advance rider was visible at the northern gate. 30 seconds. Maybe less. The study door opened. Lord Chancellor Gervain was not what she had assembled in her mind from the documents. Not older, not more dramatic. He was compact, precise, with the absence of affect that belonged to men who had spent decades making consequential decisions and had stopped experiencing them as emotionally distinct from administrative ones. He looked at Emmerich with the expression of a man visiting a situation he had allowed to develop longer than he should have, come finally to close it. Then he looked at Lysandra. He looked at her the way people looked at something they had not included in their calculations, and that was precisely the look she had been waiting for. "Duchess," he said. "Chancellor," she said. From outside, the sound of Stern's company moving through the northern gate and the sound of Gervain's guards at the access roads encountering the math of a company versus 8 men, and making the only calculation available to professionals in that situation. Gervain heard it. She watched him hear it. He looked at the cabinet. He looked at the key she was not touching, but that he had calculated was somewhere on her person. He looked at the window, where the military configuration outside was becoming rapidly definitive, and he looked back at her. "You are," he said carefully, "considerably more resourceful than anticipated." "I've been told," she said, "that the people who underestimate me tend to find that instruction arrives somewhat late to be useful." The silence in the study had the quality of something suspended at its highest point, the moment before everything that has been accumulating resolves into the specific shape of its consequence. Gervain stood between the door and the cabinet. Stern's men were in the courtyard. The secondary documentation was 18 inches behind her back. The third file was 3 hours north, in a general's hands, already beyond reach. Gervain's face made a series of small adjustments, each one representing the death of a possible move, until what remained was the expression of a man who had arrived at the last room in a house and found it occupied. "The documents in that cabinet," he said, "are not sufficient on their own to—" "I know," she said. "That's why they're not on their own." He went very still. Outside, boots on the entrance steps. Stern's officer requesting admission in the formal language of military authority, which Brennan was answering in the formal language of a household extending full cooperation. Gervain looked at the door. He looked at the cabinet. He looked at Lysandra Evermont standing between him and both of them, with the key against her ribs and 4 hours of dark road on her face, and nothing behind her eyes that resembled the woman he had expected to find here. "You'll want to sit down," she said. "This is going to take some time." The door to the study opened, and everything that had been inevitable since the night of the Voss reception, since Alaric's laugh across the pavilion, since the key placed in her palm, since the third file pressed against her sternum through 4 hours of darkness, arrived all at once in the room. Gervain sat. Not because she had told him to, exactly. Men like Gervain did not sit because women told them to, and they both understood that. He sat because the officer who entered behind him was Captain Aldrin of Stern's 3rd Division, who carried himself with the particular authority of a man backed by 200 armed soldiers in the courtyard, and who had addressed the Chancellor by name with the flat professional courtesy that strips a title of its social weight while technically preserving its form. The study had never felt smaller. The fire had burned low. The window showed the courtyard in military configuration, organized, unhurried, the kind of presence that does not need to announce itself because its dimensions do that work already. Gervain looked at all of it. His face did not break. Men like him did not break in the visible way. They recalculated, visibly, behind the architecture of composure, finding the new geometry of a situation that had moved past the point where their primary tools applied. "You've been thorough," he said. It was not a compliment and not quite an accusation. It was the observation of a man who is lost and wants the record to show that he understood the mechanism. "I had a good teacher," Lysandra said. His eyes moved to Emmerich in the chair by the window. The old duke had not moved since Dravain entered, had not risen, had not performed any of the physical choreography of confrontation. He simply sat, with the composure of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a room to contain the right people, and has found it, and is now simply present in it. "Emmerich," Dravain said. "Aldrich," Emmerich said. He used the Chancellor's given name without inflection, the way you use a name when the honorific no longer corresponds to anything real. "It's been a while." 20 years. 22. Emmerich looked at him steadily. "Since the Eastern Commission. Since you had Marin's husband ruled an accident." The room absorbed that. Captain Aldrin, to his credit, did not react. He was there as a legal presence, not a personal one, and he maintained that distinction with professional precision. Dravaini's jaw tightened fractionally. "That allegation is documented," Lysandra said. "In the file currently in General Stern's possession, which was delivered to his headquarters at 7 this morning, and which has been in military custody since 8. The review committee will have it before this evening." She paused. "Along with the secondary documentation from this cabinet, which Captain Aldrin will be escorting to Korath within the hour." Dravain looked at her. The recalculation behind his eyes reached its conclusion, and what emerged on the other side of it was not rage. Rage would have indicated remaining options. What emerged was the specific stillness of a man who has run the full arithmetic and arrived at 0. "What is it you want?" he said. "From this?" She considered the question, not its tactical answer. She had the tactical answer, had had it since she stood in the dark behind the bookcase and listened to his representative deliver the offer, and understood that offers from men like Dravain were structured to look like exits and function like cages. She considered what she actually wanted, and the honest accounting that the last 2 months had forced her to make about the difference between what she was doing and why. "I want the Marath claim reinstated," she said, "formally, through Justice Aldine without interference." She paused. "I want the Eastern Corridor families compensated through the Ashbourne Holding Company's current assets, since that is where the fraudulently redirected wealth ultimately resided." Another pause. "And I want your resignation from the chancellorship submitted to the imperial household today, citing health, using whatever language preserves the institution's dignity. Because the institution is not the same as you, and what comes after this doesn't have to carry the full weight of what you did." Dravain looked at her for a long moment. "That's remarkably restrained," he said. "I'm not doing this for spectacle," she said. "I'm doing it because the people it damaged are still living with the damage. And the most useful thing the next 20 years can produce is repair, not theater." Something moved across Dravain's face. Not remorse. She did not mistake it for remorse. Men like him arrived at remorse, if they arrived at it at all. In private and years later. It was closer to recognition. The recognition of a person encountering a moral framework they cannot immediately find the weakness in, which was, for a man whose entire career had been built on locating weaknesses, a genuinely unfamiliar experience. He looked at Emmerich again. "She's yours," he said, and it was meant as an observation about the shaping of her, the education. It came out as something else. "No," Emmerich said quietly, "she was never mine. That's rather the point." Acha. Dravaini's resignation reached the imperial household at 4 that afternoon, carried by Captain Aldrin along with the full documentation package, arriving on the same day as General Stern's formal presentation of the third file to the review committee. The timing was not accidental. Lysandra had understood, since the ride back from Korath, that the simultaneous arrival of resignation and evidence was the difference between a clean transfer of power and a contested one, and she had spent the intervening hours managing that timing with the same attention she had given every other variable. Aaron Voss came to the manor the following morning. He arrived alone, without announcement, on a horse that had been ridden hard, and he stood in the entrance hall with the specific quality of a man who has spent 14 years maintaining 2 identities and has, overnight, become neither of them, which left him standing in the space between, unsure of the posture. She received him in the east sitting room, not the study. The study was Emmerich's room, and would remain so for as long as Emmerich needed it. Voss looked like what he was, a man in his mid-50s who had been doing something difficult for a very long time, and had done it without the relief of telling anyone, and who was now in the presence of the person who knew, which produced an expression she had no exact word for. Not relief. Something rawer than relief. The specific exhaustion of a mask that has been held in place so long that removing it reveals not the face underneath, but the effort the holding required. "You sent the file," she said. "I sent it," he confirmed. He did not apologize for the way it had been sent, the maneuvering, the risk transferred to Emmerich and then to her. She did not ask him to apologize. She had thought about it carefully on the ride back and arrived at the understanding that resenting the instrument of something necessary was a way of avoiding gratitude for the thing itself. "Maren Aldrich's husband," she said. "Did you know when it happened?" A pause. "I suspected," he said. "I was 3 weeks into my position in Dravain's office. I had no evidence and no standing, and I made the calculation." He stopped. "It was a calculation. I have had 23 years to examine whether it was the right one." "What did you conclude?" He looked at her directly. "That it was the only one I could make if I wanted to be in a position to do what I did yesterday. And that being the only available calculation does not make it a clean one." He paused. "I don't expect that to mean anything to Maren." "It might," Lysander said. "Eventually. That's not my decision to make." She told him that General Stern wanted to speak with him about the transitional administration. Dravain's office would require interim management, and Voss was the only person with full knowledge of its operations and the demonstrated commitment to their correction. He received this without visible surprise, which told her he had already thought through the post-Dravain landscape and had arrived at the same conclusion about his own utility. He left. She sat in the east sitting room alone for a few minutes, watching the winter light move across the floor in the particular slow way that December light moved in rooms like this, honest about its own limits, not trying to be more than it was. She thought about what she had become in the specific accounting of it. 2 months ago, she had entered this house as a woman with a plan and the conviction that the plan, if well executed, was sufficient. The plan had collapsed in its 3rd week. Everything she had built had been taken apart and reassembled by forces she had not fully mapped, and she had survived it not by executing the plan, but by becoming, under the pressure of its failure, something the plan had not required her to be. That was the thing no one told you about survival. Not the versions of it that got written down, the clean narratives where the right preparation led to the right outcome. The version she had lived was messier, contingent, dependent on a horse that knew the Eastern Road and a woman who had been waiting 23 years and a general who had given his word at 7 in the morning to a duchess covered in road dust. It had worked not because she had been adequate to the plan, but because she had been willing to become adequate to what the plan's failure required. She did not know yet what to do with that understanding. She filed it in the place where honest accountings went, not the front of her mind, where they would interfere with the remaining work, but the place where things settled and became, eventually, the foundation of something else. Emmerich died on a Thursday, in the 3rd week of January, in the chair by the study window. Not in his bed, not in the manner the physicians had outlined with their careful clinical language of expected decline. In the chair, in the morning light, with the beach avenue visible through the glass and the estate ledgers open on the desk in front of him, because he had been reviewing them at 7, as he did every morning, and had simply stopped. Brennan found him. Brennan told her. She went to the study and sat with him for an hour before she did anything else, in the quiet that a room holds when the person who understood it best is no longer in it. She did not collapse. She did not perform grief for the household or manage her expression for anyone's benefit. She sat with the full weight of it, the way she had learned in the last 2 months to sit with full weights, without the impulse to make them lighter or the belief that making them lighter would serve either the weight or herself. She had known him for less than 4 months. She had known him better in those 4 months than she had known most people over years. There was a particular kind of knowing that only existed between 2 people who had decided not to waste time on the versions of themselves they performed for comfortable relationships. The version that emerged when the situation was too serious for performance, and you were left with what you actually were, and what the other person actually was, and you had to work with those materials because there was nothing else. Emmerich had known what he was, a man with declining time and a cabinet full of things that needed to outlast him, who had made the calculation that the right person, given the right tools, would do more with the remaining time than he could alone. He had not been wrong. He had also, in the space between the calculation and the end, been something she had not expected when she read his initial letter. A person who saw her clearly, without the acquisitive distortion of someone who needed her to be a particular thing, and who found what he saw interesting on its own terms. She had not had many people like that. She had had, if she was honest, almost none. The reading of the will was 3 days later, in the Manor's formal parlor, with the imperial executor and 2 witnesses and the assembled household staff. Emmerich had specified in a note attached to the document that the staff be present, which was unusual enough that the executor had noted it, and unusual enough that she had understood immediately what it meant. He had wanted them to hear it directly, not through the filtered version that reached servants through doors and corridors. He had wanted the thing to be public in the room where it mattered. The executor read it. The estate, the title, the private garrison, the political alliances, the correspondence network, the locked cabinet, which was now merely a cabinet, its contents in Stern's custody, which was exactly where Emmerich had wanted them. Everything passed to Lysandra Evermont Blackthorne, Duchess of Blackthorne, in full and without condition. The final words were in Emmerich's own hand, added at the bottom of the legal document in the careful script she recognized from the annotated maps, from the margins of the correspondence files, from the note beside the key the night he placed it in her palm. She read them privately after. She read them once, and then she folded the page and put it in her coat pocket, and she did not read them again for several months, not because they were painful, though they were, but because they were the kind of thing that needed time around them before they could be read accurately, before the fullness of what they contained could be received rather than simply processed. What they said, in his handwriting at the bottom of a legal document, was this: "Power belongs to the one who protects it with honor, not the one born to inherit it. I have known this for 40 years and lacked, for most of them, the right person to entrust with its proof. I am grateful the arithmetic worked out." She saw Alaric once more, in the second week of February, at a function she had not expected him to attend, and that he had apparently not expected her to attend either. The gathering was at Countess Ardellin's townhouse, a small political dinner, the kind where the conversation mattered more than the food, and the seating arrangement was a map of current alliances. He was standing near the east window when she arrived. He saw her before she saw him, which she registered in the fractional adjustment of his posture when she entered the room. Not retreat, not aggression, the specific stillness of a man deciding how to be in the presence of someone he had categorized incorrectly for a long time, and was now recategorizing in real time. She crossed the room to him, directly, without the social navigation of working toward an accidental encounter. She was done with indirection when directness served better. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the entrance hall of Blackthorne 4 months ago, with the assessment of a man recalculating, except that the thing behind the assessment was different now. The entitlement that had always lived underneath his attention, the baseline assumption that she was a variable in his equation rather than a person running her own, was simply gone, not suppressed. Gone, the way things go when the event that rendered them impossible is large enough. "You look well," he said. "I am," she said. A pause. Around them, the room performed its social functions, conversations layering over each other, the quiet business of an empire's upper tier renegotiating its arrangements in the aftermath of Dravain's resignation. She and Alaric were a pocket of different air inside it. "The Ashbourne contribution to the Eastern Corridor compensation," he said. "I wanted you to know I'm managing it directly, not through intermediaries." "I know," she said. "Corvin told me." Something moved across his face. "You're in contact with Marath." "Regularly?" He nodded, with the movement of a man accepting a fact he had understood intellectually and is now accepting in the body, which is a slower and different process. "I didn't know," he said, "about the full scope of my father's arrangements." "I believe you," she said. He blinked. The response had been too direct for him to process at the speed he was accustomed to, and she saw him reaching for the implication, looking for the qualification, the condition, the version of it that served her tactically. There was none. She had examined the documents and the timeline carefully and arrived at the honest conclusion that the evidence supported his claim of incomplete knowledge, and she had no interest in maintaining a more convenient version of the truth. "Why?" he said. "Because it's accurate," she said, "and because what you didn't know about your father doesn't change what you chose to do with what you did know about me." She held his gaze. "Those are separate accountings. I'm capable of keeping them separate." He was quiet for a moment. The dinner party moved around them, indifferent, I was very certain, he said slowly, that I understood what you were. He looked at her, and what was in his eyes now was not the acquisitive attention of 3 years ago, not the contempt of the pavilion, not the controlled fear of the Blackthorn entrance hall. It was something closer to the expression of a man looking at something he does not fully understand and has decided, for the first time in his life, not to pretend otherwise. I was completely wrong. You were, she said. That's the kind of mistake that's worth something, if you let it be. She did not stay for the dinner. She had arrived with a specific purpose: to attend, to be present in the room as herself, as the Duchess of Blackthorn without apology or performance. And that purpose was complete. She said her goodbyes to Countess Ardelin, who held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, and said, with the brevity of a woman who had seen a great deal and chose her words accordingly, that Emmerich would have been pleased. She believed that was true. She held it as she rode back to the townhouse she had rented in the capital for the administrative work that would occupy the next several months: the estate restructuring, the alliance correspondence, the construction of what Blackthorn would become in its next iteration. The work Emmerich had meant when he wrote the word legacy, which was not a synonym for inheritance and was not a synonym for revenge, and was not, she had come to understand, even primarily about him. It was about what a piece of ground and a set of resources and a name could be made to do, over time, in the hands of someone who understood that the purpose of power was not the having of it, yet. The Blackthorn Estates opened their eastern holdings to tenant farming cooperatives in March. At terms Lysandra had spent 6 weeks negotiating with the affected families and 3 days reviewing with General Stern, who had become, in the months since Korath, something she would cautiously have described as an ally and might, in another year, describe as a friend. The cooperatives were not charity. They were structured agreements with shared yield arrangements and investment provisions and the specific contractual dignity of arrangements between parties who both had something to offer. She had insisted on that structure against the advice of 2 solicitors who had suggested simpler philanthropic arrangements, because simpler philanthropic arrangements produced dependence, and she was not interested in building a domain founded on dependence. She was interested in building something that would outlast her, which was a different project entirely. Corvin Marath came to the manor in April, with the formal notice of the Marath inheritance reinstatement. Justice Aldine had completed her review in 38 days, 2 days inside the window Lysandra had identified at the start, and he stood in the entrance courtyard with the document in his hand and looked at it the way you look at something you stop believing would exist. "My mother," he said, "would like to meet you." "I'd like that," Lysandra said. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had entered an alliance from necessity and found, in the working of it, something he hadn't been looking for. "What you built here," he said, nodding at the manor behind her, the grounds, the movement of the estate's daily life visible in the courtyard. "Emmerich was right about you." "What did he say?" Corvin smiled briefly, the smile of a man recalling a conversation. He said he had found someone who understood that the point of winning wasn't to win. It was to still be worth something after. She stood with that in the April light, with the beach avenue behind her, putting out its first green, and the estate moving through its morning in the straightforward way of a place that had learned to trust its own rhythms. The courtyard smelled of mud and horses, and the particular freshness of ground that had been cold for a long time and was warming. Ordinary things. The kind of things that were easy to overlook when you were inside the extremity of a situation, and that reasserted themselves steadily when the extremity passed. She had lost, in the last 5 months, more than she had calculated when she accepted Emmerich's key. She had lost a plan, a channel, a set of assumptions about how systems could be changed from outside. She had lost the version of herself that believed careful preparation was a form of protection. She had lost Emmerich, who was not a loss that resolved into something clean and educational. It simply sat in her the way real losses sit, present rather than integrated, acknowledged rather than resolved. What she had in exchange was not a fair trade, because losses and gains were not currencies, and the attempt to balance them was a way of avoiding the full weight of both. What she had was the manner, and the work, and the specific quality of standing inside something she had not merely inherited but earned, through the dark road and the cold and the wrong calculations and the necessary recalculations in every moment of the last 5 months in which she had been required to become something the previous moment had not prepared her to be. Emmerich's final words, in their folded page in her pocket. The arithmetic worked out. She understood finally what arithmetic he meant. Not the arithmetic of the documents or the evidence or the legal outcomes. The arithmetic of a person, added up correctly, which was to say, honestly, without the adjustments made for comfort or the subtractions made from fear. She stood in the April courtyard and understood herself, in the full measure of that accounting, as something she had not been when she stood 12 feet from Alaric in a pavilion and gave him nothing, not harder, not colder, not armored in the way that trauma produces armor, which is to say closed. Something that had been made by everything that had tried to unmake it, into a form that had not existed before and could not have been planned for. Something that had found its shape, as all genuine things find their shape, by surviving the pressures that revealed it. She looked at Corvin. She looked at the manor. She looked at the beach avenue putting out its green. "Tell your mother," she said, "that I'll come east in May." She went inside to work. The empire around her continued its business, rearranging itself in the aftermath of Dravain, absorbing the Marath reinstatement, processing the slow corrections that moved through systems like water through stone, imperceptibly and then all at once. Alaric Ashbourne managed his reduced holdings with the specific diligence of a man who has decided that the remainder of his reputation depends on the quality of what he does rather than the quantity of what he claims, which was a decision she gave him full credit for making and no particular credit for making late. Aaron Voss took the interim administrative role in the Chancellor's office, under Stern's oversight, and did his work with the focused precision of a man spending the remaining portion of his career on the right side of the ledger he had been maintaining for 14 years. Marin Aldrich declined, when offered the option, to return to the capital, and remained in the eastern provinces, where she had built something quiet and sufficient and entirely her own. They corresponded. The letters were short and honest and asked nothing from each other but continued honesty, which was more than Lysandra had expected and exactly what she should have. In June, the Blackthorn banner was restored to the manor's east gate. The original design, the one Emmerich's grandfather had commissioned, which had been retired during the estate's years of reduced political standing, and which Lysandra had ordered restored, not as a statement of triumph, but as a statement of continuity. The thing that had been here before the damage. The thing that persisted. She stood at the east gate and looked at it in the summer evening, with the light coming low and amber across the grounds, and the banner moving in a slow wind that came off the eastern corridor, carrying the smell of distance, of open country, of roads she had ridden in the dark, and would ride again for reasons she had not yet encountered. She was 24 years old. She had the rest of it ahead of her, the rest of the work, the rest of the alliances and the mistakes and the necessary transformations, the rest of the long education of becoming someone whose understanding of power was equal to the responsibility of holding it. She knew, with the specific clarity of a woman who had been comprehensively wrong about something important and had survived the wrongness, that she would be wrong again. That the next 5 months would require things the current 5 months had not prepared her for. That preparation was not protection. What protection existed was the quality you developed in the gap between what you had planned and what the situation actually required. The willingness to look at that gap honestly, to find in it not failure, but instruction, and to move. She was willing. The banner moved in the evening wind. She turned back toward the manor, toward the study and the desk and the correspondence and the full, concrete, unromantic labor of building something worth the name her husband had entrusted her with. She did not look back at the gate. She had already seen it. That was enough.